Welcome to Godless and Grounded.
We've all been there. You're sitting across from someone, maybe a friend or a family member, and the conversation turns toward the big questions of life. Why are we here? Is there a higher power? What happens when we die? Eventually, they lean in and say something like, "I just know in my heart that it's true." Or perhaps they tell you that their belief gives them peace, so it must be grounded in reality. It's a nice sentiment, and it feels good to say, but it overlooks a fundamental law of the universe. The intensity of your belief has absolutely no bearing on the factual reality of the claim. You can believe with every fiber of your being that you can fly, but gravity isn't going to check your level of sincerity before you hit the pavement. This is the core of the conversation we need to have today. We live in a world where faith is often treated as a valid substitute for evidence, but in any other context, we would see that for exactly what it is, a logical fallacy. If I told you there was a diamond the size of a refrigerator buried in your backyard, you wouldn't just start planning how to spend the money based on how much I believed it. Let's start with a simple observation about the world. There are thousands of religions practiced across the globe today, and there have been thousands more throughout history. If you look at the map, you'll see that the religion someone follows is almost always determined by where they were born and what their parents believed. If you were born in ancient Greece, you'd be convinced that Zeus threw lightning bolts. If you were born in modern-day India, you might be a devout Hindu. If you were born in Mississippi, you're likely a Christian. All of these people feel the same inner witness. They all have personal experiences that they claim prove their specific God is the right one. But they can't all be right, because their claims often contradict each other. However, they can all be wrong. The fact that billions of people believe different, conflicting things proves that belief itself is a terrible compass for finding the truth. If belief were a reliable pathway to truth, everyone using it would eventually arrive at the same conclusion, much like scientists using the scientific method eventually agree on the boiling point of water. History is a graveyard of dead gods. There was a time when people truly believed that the sun was a chariot being pulled across the sky. They weren't lying, and they weren't stupid. They were using belief to fill a gap in their knowledge. But as soon as we developed the tools to actually measure the solar system, that belief evaporated. Evidence replaced it. This shows us a clear pattern. As our evidence grows, the space for belief shrinks. We no longer need to believe in a god of thunder, because we understand electrostatic discharge. We don't need a god of the harvest because we understand soil chemistry and meteorology. Evidence provides us with answers that actually work, while belief only provides us with stories that make us feel better about not having the answers. Consider the way we use logic in our daily lives. If you are on a jury for a murder trial, you aren't asked to believe the defendant is guilty based on a gut feeling. You are asked to look at fingerprints, DNA, CCTV footage, and witness testimony. And if the prosecutor stood up and said, "I don't have any physical evidence, but I just feel in my soul that this man did it," the judge would throw the case out immediately. We understand that in a court of law, belief is worthless without evidence. Why should the standards for the origin of the universe be lower than the standards for a shoplifting charge? If we demand evidence for the small things, we should demand even more evidence for the claims that demand we change our entire lives, our politics, and our social structures. The problem with belief is that it's a closed loop. Once you decide that belief is its own justification, you lose the ability to correct yourself. If you are wrong, you have no way of knowing it. Evidence, on the other hand, is self-correcting. Science is the only discipline that celebrates being wrong, because every time we disprove a theory, we get one step closer to what is actually true. When a bridge is built, it isn't held up by the prayers of the engineers. It's held up by mathematics and physics. If the math is wrong, the bridge falls. The universe doesn't care about our traditions or our sacred books. It only responds to the physical laws that govern it. Let's talk about the fine-tuning argument that people often bring up. They say the universe looks like it was designed for us. But this is like a puddle waking up in a hole and thinking, "Wow, this hole fits me perfectly. It must have been made specifically for me." In reality, the puddle shaped itself to the hole. We evolved to fit the universe, not the other way around. If the constants of physics were different, we wouldn't be here to complain about it. Claiming a creator exists because we are here is a circular argument. It's an attempt to find a who when we should be looking for a how. We also need to look at the reliability of religious texts. Many people point to a book as their evidence, but a book is just a collection of claims. You cannot use a book to prove the claims inside that same book. That's like saying Spider-Man is real because the comic books say he lives in New York and New York is a real place. Just because a religious text mentions historical cities or people doesn't mean the supernatural events it describes are true. We have no contemporary archaeological or historical evidence for many of the major supernatural events described in ancient scriptures. What we do have is a clear history of how these stories were written, edited, and passed down by humans with political and social agendas. Think about the concept of miracles. A miracle is usually defined as an event that breaks the laws of physics. If someone claims a miracle happened, they are making a massive claim. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is more likely that the fundamental laws of the universe were suspended for one person in one moment, or that the person reporting it was mistaken, hallucinating, or lying. Throughout history, every single miracle that has been thoroughly investigated by modern science has turned out to have a natural explanation or was a documented fraud. Not a single one has stood up to the scrutiny of a laboratory. Furthermore, let's address the idea that religion is necessary for morality. Many people believe that without a God to watch over us, we would all become monsters. But this doesn't hold up to reality. Some of the most peaceful and pro-social societies on Earth, like those in Scandinavia, are also some of the most secular. Humans are social animals. We evolved empathy and cooperation because those traits helped our ancestors survive in groups. We don't need a divine command to know that killing or stealing is harmful to the community. In fact, relying on a book for morality can be dangerous, as it allows people to justify horrific acts like war or discrimination by claiming they are following a higher authority. When we base our morality on evidence and human well-being, we can actually have conversations about what is right and wrong based on the harm or benefit it causes. Evidence is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, or how much money you have. If you drop a ball, it falls at the same rate for everyone. Truth is that which remains true even when you stop believing in it. If every human on Earth forgot everything we knew tomorrow, and all our books were burned, 1,000 years from now, we wouldn't rediscover the exact same religious stories. We wouldn't find the same gods with the same names, but we would rediscover the same laws of physics. We would rediscover the periodic table. I understand that letting go of belief can be scary. It feels like losing a safety net. But there is a profound beauty in seeing the world as it actually is. When we stop looking for answers in ancient myths, we start looking for them in each other and in the stars. We realize that our time here is short and precious, and that makes our relationships and our contributions to the world even more meaningful. We don't need a why from a creator to find purpose. We create our own purpose by learning, by loving, and by exploring the incredible universe we find ourselves in. The next time someone tells you that they believe something is true, ask them for the evidence. Not because you want to be difficult, but because you value the truth. We owe it to ourselves to live in reality. We've spent enough of human history in the dark, whispering to the shadows. It's time to turn on the lights. Evidence is the only tool we have that actually works. And it's the only way we can build a future based on facts rather than illusions. Historically, whenever humans couldn't explain something like the origin of a mountain range or the cause of a plague, they attributed it to a divine hand. But as our scientific tools improved, those gaps in our knowledge began to close. Not once in human history has a phenomenon been investigated, and the final answer turned out to be magic or divine intervention. It has always, 100% of the time, been a natural explanation. If you used a map where the unexplored sections were labeled as "Here be dragons," you wouldn't be surprised when a ship finally sails there and finds only water. Belief is the dragon on the map. Evidence is the ship that actually goes there to see. Relying on belief is essentially betting against the entire track record of human progress, which shows that the unknown is simply the not yet discovered, not the supernatural. Let's dive deeper into the history of how these beliefs actually formed, because understanding the why behind the belief often reveals that there is no what behind the claim. When we look at the evolution of religion, we see a very human process of trial and error. Early humans were survival machines. Our brains evolved to see patterns even where they didn't exist, because it was safer to mistake a rustling bush for a lion than to mistake a lion for the wind. This is called agent detection. We are wired to assume someone or something is behind the curtain. This kept us alive on the savannah, But it also led us to believe that the wind, the rain, and the stars were controlled by conscious beings. We projected our own human psychology onto the universe. We assumed that if we were angry, the sky must be angry too. We assumed that if we needed a gift to be forgiven, then the gods must need a sacrifice. This isn't divine revelation. It is biological leftover. We are literally haunted by the survival instincts of our ancestors. When you realize that the feeling of a presence in a room or a sign from the universe is just your brain's pattern recognition software misfiring, the supernatural explanation starts to look a lot less like truth and a lot more like a glitch. Consider the biological reality of our own bodies. If we were designed by an all-knowing, all-powerful being who wanted us to flourish, the evidence of that design is remarkably poor. We have a blind spot in our eyes where the optic nerve passes through the retina, an engineering flaw that octopuses don't have. We have a recurrent laryngeal nerve that travels from the brain, down past the heart, and back up to the throat, a ridiculous detour that only makes sense if we evolved from fish-like ancestors. We have vestigial organs like the appendix or the tailbone that serve no purpose other than to remind us of our evolutionary past. If you bought a car with as many design flaws as the human body, you'd return it to the dealership. The evidence doesn't point to a perfect creator. It points to natural selection, a process that doesn't care about perfection, only about being good enough to survive long enough to reproduce. Belief ignores these flaws to maintain a narrative of specialness, but evidence forces us to accept that we are part of a messy, unguided, and incredibly long biological struggle. Let's get into the logical side of things, specifically the problem of evil. This is an argument that has haunted theologians for centuries because it exposes a massive contradiction. If a God is all-powerful, he could stop suffering. If he is all good, he would want to stop suffering. Yet suffering exists on a massive scale. We aren't just talking about human choices or free will. We are talking about childhood leukemia, tsunamis, and parasites that eat the eyes of children from the inside out. There is no moral lesson in a toddler dying of a preventable disease. To say God has a plan is not an argument. It's an admission that you have no evidence to explain why a benevolent being would allow such horrors. If we saw a human stand by and watch a child drown when they had the power to save them, we would call that person a monster. Why do we give a pass to a deity for the same behavior? The evidence of the world we see, a world of indifferent suffering, is perfectly consistent with a universe that has no conscious designer. The burden of proof is a concept that people often try to flip, but logic doesn't work that way. If I claim that there is an invisible, intangible teapot orbiting the sun, you can't prove me wrong. But your inability to disprove it doesn't make it likely that the teapot exists. The person making the claim is the one who has to provide the evidence. For thousands of years, theists have claimed a God exists, yet they have never produced a single piece of objective, verifiable data. Instead, they ask atheists to prove God doesn't exist. You can't prove a negative. You can't prove there aren't invisible fairies in my garden. This is the only way to avoid being overwhelmed by an infinite number of false ideas. We should also look at the fine-tuning of religious books themselves. If a book were truly written or inspired by the creator of the universe, wouldn't it contain information that the people of that time couldn't have known? Imagine if the Bible or the Quran contained the formula for penicillin, or the exact distance to the moon, or an explanation of germ theory. That would be compelling evidence. Instead, these books contain exactly what you would expect from people living in those specific centuries. They contain the same scientific errors, the same local biases, and the same tribal prejudices of their authors. These books don't look like divine maps for humanity. They look like historical artifacts of a developing species. When we treat them as evidence for the supernatural, we are ignoring the very clear evidence that they are products of their time. Furthermore, let's talk about the psychological comfort of belief. People often say, even if it's not true, it makes people happy. But is it better to be happy in a lie or to be empowered by the truth? When we base our actions on false beliefs, we make mistakes. If you believe that prayer will cure a disease, you might skip the doctor, and people have died because of that. If you believe that the end of the world is coming soon because of a prophecy, you might not care about climate change or the long-term health of the planet. Beliefs have consequences. Truth, backed by evidence, allows us to make predictions and solve problems. We eradicated smallpox because we stopped praying and started vaccinating. We reached the moon because we used physics, not faith. We also have to address the idea of personal experience. This is the strongest evidence for most believers, but it's the weakest scientifically. Our brains are incredibly easy to fool. We experience sleep paralysis, hallucinations, confirmation bias, and the placebo effect. People have personal experiences of being abducted by aliens, seeing ghosts, or feeling the presence of gods that they don't even believe in. If you take a certain drug or stimulate a certain part of the brain, you can trigger a religious experience on demand. This tells us that these feelings are internal, not external. They are products of the brain, not windows into another dimension. If your truth depends on a feeling that can be replicated by a magnet or a mushroom, then it isn't a universal truth. It's a biological event. Choosing evidence over belief isn't about being cynical or cold. It's about honesty. It's about having the courage to say, "I don't know," rather than making up an answer. When we follow the evidence, we don't lose our sense of wonder. We gain a sense of reality. We see that we are the architects of our own meaning. We don't need a judge in the sky to tell us to be kind. We have each other. We don't need a paradise after we die to make this life matter. The fact that this is our only life makes every moment infinitely more valuable. Belief is a dead end, but evidence is a journey. Let's look at the sheer scale of the universe as a piece of evidence that contradicts almost every religious narrative. Most belief systems center on the idea that humans are the crown of creation and that the entire cosmos was built as a stage for our moral drama. But when we look through the Hubble or James Webb telescopes, we see a universe that is roughly 93 billion light-years across, containing trillions of galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars. If the universe was designed for us, it is an incredible waste of space. The evidence suggests that we are not the center of everything, but a tiny, accidental byproduct of a vast and indifferent cosmic process. This doesn't make us less significant, but it does make the belief that a creator is intensely concerned with our personal lives or our dietary habits seem mathematically absurd. We also have to consider the evidence of linguistics and how it exposes the human origin of divine messages. The Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic used in various holy books are not celestial languages. They are specific, localized dialects that evolved from earlier Afro-Asiatic or Indo-European roots. We can track how certain religious concepts and even the names of deities were borrowed from older neighboring cultures. For example, many of the stories in the early parts of the Middle Eastern traditions share striking similarities with much older Sumerian and Babylonian myths. The evidence shows a clear genealogy of ideas, where humans were simply rewriting and updating the stories of their neighbors. Belief claims these stories fell from the sky, but the evidence shows they were built on the ground, brick, by people copying what came before them. Finally, consider the evidence of how our brains actually handle certainty. There is a phenomenon called certainty bias, where the brain rewards us with a hit of dopamine when we feel like we have an answer, regardless of whether that answer is actually correct. This is why it feels so good to believe, and so uncomfortable to be in a state of doubt. Our brains are literally wired to prefer a simple, comforting lie over a complex, difficult truth. Religions tap into this biological reward system by offering total certainty in exchange for faith. But just because a thought makes your brain feel safe doesn't mean that thought corresponds to a physical reality. When we prioritize evidence, we are choosing to override that primitive craving for easy answers. We are deciding that the truth is more important than a chemical hit of comfort. This is the ultimate mark of intellectual maturity. The ability to sit with the discomfort of the unknown until the evidence gives us a real reason to move forward.